Thank you, everyone. My name is Natifa Ford, and I'm the acting interim executive director of the New York City Young Men's Initiative, and also the executive director of a new office that's being created that is called NYC Her Future. Both offices are focused on addressing the disparities that young people of color face across New York City. And we do it across a few different forums where we focus on education, workforce development, health, safety, and a strong focus around justice reform. So for us today, we're excited to be here with these two panelists that I will introduce, but wanted to just kind of give you a grounding in who I am, how I show up in the place, and how I will be talking about it. So both of our offices are mayoral offices, and we both report into the New York City's Mayor's Office of Racial Equity and Justice. So today on this panel, you will be speaking with Deidre Appel, who is over communication advocacy manager for Open Data Watch. And as the communication and advocacy manager, she spearheads efforts to amplify Open Data Watch's impact in shaping global policies, agendas, and ensuring that data remains at the forefront of the development agenda, including open data around gender equity, smarter financing for data overall. She holds a master's degree of global policy studies with a specialization in international development from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. So Deidre, I'll allow you to just say welcome and say a few words to them, and I'll introduce our second panelist.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I'm sure after a long, exciting Open Data Week. I'm based in South Dakota, but I used to live in New York City for many years. So I'm very excited and happy to be participating in New York City Open Data Week. And just really looking forward to the conversation, and I'll dive in a bit more into, the topic of open data for gender equality. But as our name suggests, open data is at the forefront of our work at Open Data Watch, and we're really excited to be here. So thanks so much for the invitation, and looking forward.
Thank you so much, Deidre. And our next panelist is Mercedes de los Santos, who is the project director of Open Data Charter. Mercedes de los Santos has spearheaded projects in the civil society sector of Buenos Aires in the last 10 years, and as the director of citizenship and government institutions Directoral Legislativo. She works with the Latin American government and civil society organization to make government and legislation in the region more open, participatory, and inclusive. And I'm going to allow her to talk and put her spin on what I just said. But thank you so much, Mercedes. And if you can come off mute and really kind of share a few words for folks before we get into the discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank Natifa for the presentation, and it's a pleasure for me to be in this amazing conversation today. I'll share the panel with Deidre and you and Natifa. It's the second time that we participated at the New York City Open Data Week. So it's a pleasure to be here again and to talk about this really important topic about use open data to close gender gaps and to close gender inequalities. So I'm very excited to listen and to learn about your initiatives. I'm very open to receive all the questions of the people that are attending this session. I will talk about our work on gender and care agenda. And congratulations for this amazing and busy week. So thank you again for the invitation. I hope all the people here enjoy all the things that we have to talk.
Thank you both for really kind of grounding your introductions. I do want to say that the topic of this discussion will be really to talk about data and its usage of closing gender equality and gender inequalities. As we kind of speak about the city that we're in New York City, there's a lot of context around it, but we're going to take the opportunity to learn from these two individuals on the call to really hear about what they're doing in other municipalities and also other nations to really figure out how they're using open data as a forum to really kind of lead with not just results-based, but really lead with data to create policies and legislations that are grounded in what the data is showing us that the people are actually experiencing and wanting. So I think the conversation is going to be fruitful. We're going to jump in, and I think there will be an opportunity for you guys to really dive in and ask some great questions and allow them the opportunity to really kind of answer your questions and think about ways and where the work is relevant for New York City, and really think about the intersection and all of the work that's happening here. Are you guys ready? All right.
Yes.
So just to kind of start off, right? Curious for you guys to share to the group, when did you first make the connection that data and people access to it was one of the driving forces to make change?
The first connection about open data and how open data can help to address gender inequalities or social inequalities was in 2021 when we started a project together with Buenos Aires city government, which was one of the projects that will be present later. I think I'm not sure if we answer the question or we will present it, we will make our presentation. But with that project, the objective of our project was to try to show government the care needs of the society living in Buenos Aires. So for that, we try to include all the information that the Buenos Aires government has in a platform showing the supply and demand of care. What is the objective of that platform, and why it's the connection between open data and gender agenda? It's because we identify that the disparity in workforce between women and men, it's because the most of the women, or the unequal distribution of care. So the government has a lot of care services that offer for women, but they don't know exactly if the public policies that they are offering are really connected with the demand of the care demand of the population that lives in Buenos Aires. So this is the first time that we start working with using open data in gender agenda. And then we try to expand this project in other local government, because we think that it's a problem that we share as a world or globally. So we test that indicator that we built for Buenos Aires city in a second city, which was Mexico City. But I will leave here, and then I can continue.
Thank you, Mercedes. And we would definitely like to pick your brain and hear about some of the trends that you were seeing in those municipalities of what was working. But we'll pass it over to Deidre now.
Great. No, good question to start us off. And I think perhaps I'll give a little context on who Open Data Watch is, where we're coming from. I think as it's a little bit different than, the New York City perspective, but, like anything, there's a lot to learn from, wherever you're sitting. So Open Data Watch is an international nonprofit organization that sits at the intersection of open data and official statistics. So a lot of the work that we do is primarily with national statistics offices through the lens of global agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're coming from a perspective very focused on what data is available for users, citizens, other government representatives, advocates, people like any of us on the call, that's a public good provided by the government that can be used for a range of policies and programs. And in the case of, this discussion, for social inequalities and gender equality. And so we kind of have a 10,000 foot view, I think, on the openness of gender data around the world. And that's through one of our new tools called the Gender Data Compass that I'm happy to share more about. But I think when we first, realized the connection between open data and impact in people's lives was, decades ago when there was this push for transparency, accountability of, what the government is collecting, data that's collected by individuals, and how that can be published in a way that is accessible to users like all of us on the call to either drive for change through advocacy or, really create the policies to drive change through, the government. So that's kind of the perspective that we're looking at this conversation through. Really the National Statistics Offices and what is being collected, published, or not collected and not published, and how that can be used in a way that's impactful and positively impactful.
Thank you. So as you guys can hear, it definitely is around this piece of really kind of going back to the core of making sure that government is more transparent and really accountable for the things that they're not only just doing for our constituents and the public, but also what they're collecting. And I think it's really interesting, as you mentioned, Deidre, just like also trying to understand the gaps in the data as well, because sometimes we think we're collecting the right things and we go, this is not informing us what we really need to do to move forward. So in Mercedes, you lifted up earlier about the work that you were doing in Argentina and those places. And I want you guys to understand, although we're in New York, so much of the work is relevant of what's happening. And we're also in a place where we can learn from other municipalities. And we also can learn from what's happening at other nations and what are some of the successful things that they're doing, and learn, right? If it wasn't successful, what are some of the ways in which we can implement so that we're making sure that work is really how we're data and how we're making it accessible to the public is also at the forefront of how we're deciding which policies and legislations we're moving with, because these are the things that become programs on the ground and initiatives. And that's how my work comes into play here, right? The data that is utilized are the programs and are the disparities that we intend on addressing through creating policy, public policy and programs. So would love for you guys to kind of pivot just quickly and talk about a little bit of your passion. Where does your passion from data come from? Because it's one thing to know about how it fits into your organizational body of work and how you work at it, but where is this passion from, where you're seeing things and you wake up every day and this is at the core of your, like, I do this work. It's hard having these conversations with governments. It's hard having these conversations. I know it is, having these conversations with public programs where we're like, we don't want to share our data, right? But every day you get up and it is something that is driving you to say that this is necessary. So if you can share with us what those things are, then we have a full context of who you are and how you show up in the work.
Okay. I started working in open government agenda, which is more general than open data, 10 years ago, I think. I have started working in Buenos Aires city government as a public officer. So there, I realized the importance of to opening up data to try to think the task and the policies that I carried on. So I think that in that moment I realized two things. One is very important to have data to improve public policy, because if not, we are taking decision and we don't know or we don't have in mind what is a real problem, and that policy maybe could be not effective or doesn't solve the problems of daily life. And then the second way is because it's very important to be more transparency for people. It's the only way to that citizen has to control and monitor the governmental action. So that was my first time facing Open Data Project and an agenda. And now I'm working in a global organization that work promoting opening up data and different public policies in thematic agenda like climate change, gender, land governance, anti-corruption. And so now I can be that data and open data. It's present in all the thematic agenda. It's not about to talk about open data. It's to use open data to try to bring other thematic objectives, like for example to fight against climate change, to try to bring to try to get a gender equality, try to fight for corruption actions, try to be the management of the resource more efficient. So now it's part of my life. So so thinking data is part of my life. Actually, I'm writing my thesis about the use of open data in care policies. So it's professional and personal objective that I have to continue working on that.
Thank you. And I like how you tied in that it is now professional and personal. So I think as you're coming to this work, I think the folks on the line really understand how you're showing up in this space. And thank you for grounding it like that. And thank you for being so honest and transparent with us. I appreciate that. Deidre?
Yeah, sure. This is a great question because sometimes you dive into these conversations and you don't really get to understand the passion behind, why or how people are showing up. So no, thanks for the question. For me, it was really, you read in the bio, my background's in international development. So I came to the data world and, the open data world through a perspective of really wanting to understand how us as the USA provides aid to other countries and how and if and in what ways that money and funding is having an impact on the lives of folks in these other countries. So my perspective comes from really wanting to understand the impact of policy and how data and evidence allows us to know where and how our money is spending and if it's making a difference and in what ways. And, you quickly find if you're, in this space that a lot of other countries, and, this is a generalization, but, I'm happy to give more specifics. In certain other countries, there's a lot of data gaps. There's a lack of capacity. We sit in the United States or in New York City or wherever you are with a lot of technological advancements, but in other parts of the world, it's paper-based records. It's a census from, 20 years ago. There's a lack of data to inform not only policy, but also the impact of policy too. So, the openness aspect comes from the ability for people, not only government, but individuals to be able to hold account and really also understand the transparency around the impact of data and how funding and money is being spent to, at the end of the day, improve lives, but how that's happening and in what impact is it happening too. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in this space, definitely from an international development perspective. But, like we said, it's all connected in a lot of these conversations around how data can inform our policy, and the impact of policy happens, anywhere, at the municipal level, the local level, the global level, all of it. So very relevant in that aspect.
Thank you, Deidre. And thank you for also tying in your perspective. And I think it's important that we lift up that you do have this US perspective from this lens of what the US government is providing aid to other countries, but also understanding, is the aid actually doing the thing and having the impact that it intended on having? So I think it's a perfect, you guys are perfect on this panel to really talk about and cover the lens from the US perspective to what happens in other countries. And I know we're getting some questions in on the chat, so I want to be mindful of that. So we'll have Alex from Open Data that will be tracking it. It's kind of hard as I'm facilitating to track that. And thank you so much, Mercedes, for jumping in there and answering questions. I do want to go into some more specific questions, and I want to start with you, Deidre, and then Mercedes, I'll have a question for you after. So just trying to ground us in this US context, I think there is this piece of many people in the US are under the assumption that the US Census is the main and probably one of, I don't want to say most effective, but it is the way that, our nation collects all of its data from all of the communities. And are there other prominent ways that data is collected in the US that we're unaware of? And if not, do you have any overall recommendations? That's a lot. Feel free that it's a lot, I know, but let's go for it.
No, no, that's totally fine. And I'm gonna jump into the chat too as I'm, participating and also listening into the conversation. So I certainly, what drove me into this space was that US perspective. When I was in school, it was, how is the US aid, the Agency for International Development spending money? But since now my work at Open Data Watch, we're much broader than, just what is the US doing? It's very much looking at what other countries are doing, what's happening at the country level. It's very global in that respect. But so I can speak to it in both the US, but also some other countries. And a lot of the time our perspective is also in support of low and middle income countries. So while the census is definitely a major source of data for policy making, from when they start collecting it to throughout the years that follow, it's also a major undertaking, both in terms of financial and technical and human resources. So when we think about the undertaking for the US to do that, when we think about other countries that don't necessarily have the kind of funding or digital technology or all this other stuff, and how core of a data source it is, just to show that gap between, countries in terms of a core data source. So of course, the census is one of the things that we look at too when we're, supporting and assessing countries is whether or not that they've conducted a census at that, cadence that's required or recommended. But there's also in between a lot of other data sources that can be used to collect information. I think one that's probably overlooked is administrative systems and civil registration systems. So this is kind of the continuous collection of data on individuals, both in terms of, for example, the civil registration is birth, death, marriage, and divorce. There's a lot that can be collected in these kind of core life events, vital life events, that can be used for gender equality or social equality. Birth and death, of course, you're understanding population growth and some of the, the trends around that. But there's also a lot that goes into then access to services by having your, legal registration and name and whatnot. In terms of marriage and divorce, the kind of dimensions of gender equality there as well, and the ability to have access to child rights or alimony or all these things. So while the census is one, also these sources that are continuously collecting data on us, or that we're giving our data through registration is important. And we're much on the side of official statistics, but you can't kind of think about data sources without then big data and how everything on your phone is being collected, your web searches and things like that. But again, recognizing that there is a difference in capacity between countries around the world as well. In terms of some of our partners in low and middle income countries, surveys are a really big source of information as well for policymaking. So this could be anything from household surveys, going door to door and collecting information from the population, as well as things like labor force surveys, understanding how people are spending their time for work, employment, time use, a lot of different ways that there can be data collected in between these major marks of the census, which can also take a lot of time as well. So I'll pause there and then see perhaps if there's anything else on more of the municipality, country level, city level.
Thank you so much for that. I think that kind of sums it up, like in the sense of sometimes here in the US, we kind of think the census is the end all be all for how we're understanding our society is growing and tracking trends. And we tend to let that be a starting point. But I think as you laid it out for us, that should just be a starting point and not the end point, because I think there are other ways in administrative places that you lifted up that we should be understanding and identifying different trends within our society. So I really appreciate that. And I do want to just switch over to Mercedes and kind of build upon this because there is this piece of like what's happening here. But I'm curious for you, Mercedes, to speak a little bit about one, what is your process of engaging with nations when you begin to talk about open access to data, and specifically if you can talk about if you've seen any open access to data in Argentina that differs from the level of access of data in the United States, or just other parts of the world or other Latin American countries. That's a loaded question too. Do you want me to repeat it, or did you catch it all?
No, I think that I got it, but if not, you can have a sorry again the question, but I think that I'm okay.
Okay. Thank you.
The process now, it's okay. We have a network, Open Data Charter have a network, or it's an organization, or it's a collaboration with more than 170 government. So we have different process of work with the countries, because as Deidra said, the level of openness of their data, it's very different in all over around the world. I think that sometimes there is a connection between the level of the income country with the open data agenda, because sometimes when the country has the resource to work or to destiny to work on open data, they can create, for example, a statistical office with more research to produce, to collect data, or they have more research to have in all the thematic areas, one area to work on data. But sometimes something that happens, it depends also on the civil society organization that works in the country. Because when we work in this agenda, we always said that the most relevant thing is to try to think in the user of that data. And if the civil society organization or the user are very active, they ask for the government to open in more information. And I don't remember the wording in English, but I say obligam to the government to produce more information that they have. So it's very important to have citizens asking government for data. And so sometimes it's about research, and sometimes it's about the activists of the citizens asking for data. Then another thing that I think that it's very important to introduce the open data thematic agenda in governments, in the government agenda, is the international commitment. Sometimes when the governments commit internationally in different thematic agendas, they are obligated to give information about their policies and to produce data to inform the international commitment that they are working in different agendas, like, for example, climate change, the Paris Agreement. So I think that there are a lot of factors or things that impact in the process of opening data. Then there are a lot of tools that measure the level of open data in the different governments. And now I think that states, UK, and Chile in Latin America has the highest score in for example, in the Global Data Barometer on the Open Data Index. But the thing is, see figure, okay. So regarding to your second question about the comparison between Argentina and states, we're in a very difficult political situation now. And sometimes the level of opening data, it depends on the governments that the party that are in the government, and it changes a lot. Unfortunately, the open data agenda, it's not it's not an agenda that maintained during the years. When a new government when the government accepts a new period, they change some policies or some agendas that the civil society could bring. So now I think that that states the state probably has a bigger score than Argentina in open data things, but I think that it depends on the moment and the context. It's very, in my opinion, I think that it's very important to keep or to maintain the asking data to government, monitoring what the government does, and that's the key or the way in where it's more difficult for government to leave the data agenda in the office. And it's part of the process to advance in more open data goals. That is my answer for now, but I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you absolutely did. So thank you for that. And I know sometimes the comparison is not always an equitable comparison, but I just want to be mindful of just like setting the framing. So I think you really spoke to it. And I think the piece that you kind of lifted up that I think is important, and I think Deidre kind of spoke to it, but didn't explicitly talk to it, it's the timing also has to be right. And you do have to have willingness from government. But I really appreciate you kind of lifting up, Mercedes, that advocacy and citizens also have to be at the forefront of requesting this. It can't just be on the work of the organizations. It has to be a collective of saying this is what's needed, and this is how it will be utilized. So I really kind of appreciate you kind of synthesizing and bringing that to the forefront. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Mercedes.
Yeah. And another thing that I forget to mention, which is very important, a part of the demand of civil society to keep the openness of the data is to create some legal framework that mandates to government to publish information. We know that sometimes that the law exists, it's not the guarantee to that the government opening up data, but it's a good first steps because at least you have a law about how you have to take decision and how to have to inform citizens what you are doing with your government. So sometimes when we think or we discuss if the law is good or not, or if the law it's a benefit for opening up policies or not, I think that yes, it's very important. It's very important because it's the first steps to at least to start conversation. And if the government is new, at least has a law which say that they should publish information. Of course, always try to make a balance between privacy and the data that could be open. And then the second point that I forgot to mention is the governance model that the government has to produce and use the data. That's another thing that it's very important because change the culture, yes, of the officer that manage the data, because sometimes exists a law, exists the civil society that demand for data, but the officers which work with the data doesn't have the experience working on that, or doesn't have the process of how to manage that data. So it's very important to create together a governance model to understand how the data should be managed.
Go ahead, Deidre, jump in. Mercedes is on a roll.
I don't want to take away from your job as moderating, but I think Mercedes brought a really good point about the law and the foundations and the policies that are in place. I think that, from where we sit, that's crucial for enabling the systems to be able to, ensure that open data are in fact open and that there is the accountability for, that law to be implemented. But it's also very challenging, I think, both for citizens and government alike to be able to monitor that. And that's where organizations like the Open Data Charter, like Open Data Watch, I'm sure, the Office of Open Data at, NYC does that as well, with making sure that it's actually being put into practice. And so one thing, I would just want to, if folks are interested in the US perspective from, the call too, we have a tool called the Gender Data Compass, and I'll put it in the chat as well. But we work to kind of do that heavy lifting of the monitoring for citizens and civil society to also be able to use it to say, we do have these laws in place, but from this assessment that, organization like Open Data Watch did, we actually don't have the data publicly available and it's not there. And it allows, advocates or even folks within government to make the case within, their circle to say, based on this external assessment, we don't have any of the data open, or it's not even published on our website. And so you can see here, and I'll see if I'll just share my screen quickly. But here I just pulled up the US country profile page, and this is part of that assessment where we've looked at all of the data on the government websites and databases to see, we have availability here, we have some of these other indicators, but I've pulled up openness in particular to show, where are we lacking the data and where is the data actually being available. And in this case, Mercedes brought up climate change before. Environment is notorious for being always, not open and not, available and having the certain open data standards, and a whole range of other ones. So our effort is that this could be used as a tool where, government representatives and civil society can also push for better data, more open data, and some accountability as well. And some of the openness gaps that we look at, very technical, sometimes, more of the sector examples of understanding what might be not published, but, the technical aspects are important too, understanding that there is metadata, that there are download options, that there is, terms of use that allows for openness and open data to really be put into practice. So this is a very interesting, I think, display of what can be used when other organizations take on the work of monitoring to allow other folks to take up this and work towards improvements as well. And I'll add it in the chat too, so folks can explore further.
Thank you for that. That was needed, Deidre, and I think you kind of move us into the next part of the work. I think of the discussion, we started off with kind of grounding us in the organizations and the work that you do, understanding your why, your purpose, and then just kind of giving a general overview of what the work looks like from a global context, right? Speaking of what's happening in America, but also not acting like New York is the center of everything. And thinking about other municipalities and other nations to understand what they're doing. But we all know we're here because the point of this is really to discuss gender equality, and as we say, gender to address gender inequities. So a lot of my work in the office that I sit under is the Mayor's Office of Racial Justice, of Equity and Racial Justice. So a lot of this data is the data that we see on a day-to-day. And a lot of our offices under this umbrella look at the data to really address disparities that we're seeing done by populations or even a specific focus on groups. So would like to kind of shift and speak more a little bit to the gender piece, as we're really in this space of understanding globally how, and forgive me, how individuals, women, and those who identify as such are in comparison to their male counterparts. I would love for you guys to talk about, and Deidre, you just kind of did it, to really talk about across the different domains as it relates to health, safety, workforce development. What are some of the trends that you guys are seeing? And what are some of the gaps that you're seeing in the data that really policy and program is at the intersection of really kind of merging to create and address those disparities?
I'm happy to jump in and kind of just pick up from, what I had ended with before. But yeah, so we've been working, I think, through this framework of the Sustainable Development Goals that were launched in 2015. It's a 15-year global agenda, which all the countries of the UN have signed on for, and it's this blueprint for working towards sustainable development. There's 17 goals. One of them is specifically devoted to gender equality, SDG 5. And it's been a massive undertaking, I think, internationally and globally. And also it's something that's been localized too. I think New York City even has this, local interpretation of the SDGs and how it can, work towards some of these goals. But globally, it has over 200 indicators that can be tracked to move towards 2030, which is the end mark of the Sustainable Development Goals. And within them, there's a handful of gender relevant indicators. A lot of them, when we started in 2015, were not available. There was not even a methodology of how to begin to collect some of these indicators. We're 7 years into the agenda, and there's been a lot of progress that's been made. There's been ways to close gaps in terms of adding questions to certain surveys, or to begin to put together new surveys to capture gender data gaps. But we see that, generally speaking, globally, the health tends to be quite, better results-wise in terms of what's available. And that comes from a lot of longstanding, well-funded surveys that happen within countries. So you might have heard of the Demographic Health Survey, or another one that's called MIX. And these are 2-3 year surveys that are continuously collecting information, a lot of the times on reproductive health, maternal mortality, things like childhood stunting and wasting, and some of these indicators. But there's a whole other range of indicators that impact and kind of highlight how individuals move through lives that just aren't collected. So one of the SDG indicators is something like access to green space, which, it's incredible that is one of the indicators, but it's this idea of living a sustainable, dignified life where you actually have access to green space, and that's one of the indicators. But we have a lot of gender data gaps when it comes to employment. In a lot of parts of the world, there is informal employment that's not captured by more traditional ways of understanding the economy. Things like unpaid care labor, the idea that, there are massive undertakings that individuals have in terms of household work, childhood care, elderly care, that are economic drivers, but are just not part of these standard GDP indicators. So a lot of work being done on employment, how individuals spend their time, how they contribute to the economy. And we're also seeing, I think, just with the time and the climate, agenda and whatnot, environment, the connection between gender equality and the environment and the onset of climate change and the challenges that come alongside it have also been really drastic in terms of the availability that's not there. So the Gender Data Compass shows one of the indicators that we look at across the 185 countries is mortality rates based on natural disasters. And so there's not even in some of the countries, there's not even that data on, some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, how perhaps women, men, and other individuals are being impacted by the climate change and whatnot. So yeah, probably too many sectors to talk about in terms of gaps, but there is also a lot of work being done to fill them and partners that are being, pushing that agenda forward as well.
Thank you, Deidre, for that. And I think you lifted up a lot of key points, but I do want to give Mercedes some time to answer the question, and then we can come back and dive into some of the things that were lifted up. Mercedes?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Natifa. I'm agree with what Deidre mentioned before. Something that it's really relevant that I mentioned before. We had to try to work together with government in the process of opening that up data with a purpose, and because that's a way to thinking why we are opening up data, and thinking in the impact of that data could have when the information will open. It's very important to understand the benefit of data in the public policy. We have been working on the gender agenda for many years, together supporting governments in opening up data, for example, in the care sector. For that, with the Buenos Aires city government and Mexico City, we create a care system indicator. And the first things that we think is why we need a care system indicator. Why we need data to understand care. And from a policy perspective, it's clear that government needs to redesign a new scheme to address the care crisis. And it's very complex because there are a lot of actors involving in the process of the care ecosystem. So it's very relevant to try to get all the information about care in one platform and have evidence to understand the care needs of one society. It's fundamental to advance in, for example, a care system. That is something that a lot of governments are talking about. I think that New York City government too, to create new care systems, because it's very important to create policy for women, but they are not talking about the data that could fill that care system. So for that, for us, it's very important to work together with government to have that evidence, to identify potential care need, and to plan and redesign care policy and programs. I think that it's the key point of the question. And of course, that care crisis, or the information that we include in the care system, affect or are related to climate change and climate crisis, are related to social inequalities, because the women take care more hours than men, but poor women take care more hours than rich women. So it's also an economic problem. And so for that, I think that the data shows you what are we talking about. What is the problem that we have to try to solve? In that system, we create around, for Buenos Aires City, we created 25 indicators about care and care supply and care demand. And we organized the system asking the question of who and how many need and will need care. In one side, we have all the information about the actors that provide care, such as public sector, private sector, household, and community-based organizations. And then we collect all the information about who receives care in a city, for example, in a local context. And we found that the priority population is children and adolescents, elderly people, and people with disabilities. And when we work with that, we find a lot of challenges or gaps within that with this information. First, it's the personal data. The gender data is not segregated to try to have more specific the public policies. And sometimes the indicators that we create are built with, for example, with public service, like an annual household survey or time use service. That are services that are producing every year, for example, or every 6 months. That service are produced every 4 years or 2 years. And sometimes you need information in the moment to try to promote or solve or to improve a specific public policy. So the update of the data, it's a challenge for that kind of, for gender, the update and the disaggregation of the data, it's a challenge for gender policies. Another thing, for example, for care, it's sometimes the data is not only produced by the government. Sometimes the communitarian organization provide a care service, and the information that the communitarian organization use at informal information that are not structured, are closed, or sometimes they don't want to share with the government the information that they manage. But they manage a lot of information because they attend a lot of women all days, at the midday, in the afternoon, at night, and the government has to have that information to give them resources to improve their work, or at least to know what happened in the territory. And then the third challenge that we find working on care agenda is that the private sector has a priority role in the care ecosystem, because there are a lot of institutions that provide care that are private, and the government doesn't have that information because it's private information or it's information to make money, or and it's very difficult for the community that work in open data to involve the private sector in that kind of policies or initiatives. So I think that it's a work that we have to do together, inviting different sectors and understanding the problems or the benefits that the sector that you are inviting could have working with you in that kind of project. I will leave there because we are on time. Sorry.
No, it's never enough time to discuss all of these things. But I do want to leave on just a note, because we are wrapping up on time. But if there's one key takeaway that you want individuals to get from this discussion, what is it? And also, how are ways where individuals can participate and become more active in supporting open data? Making sure that data is open and accessible, not just for government, but for individuals, because I think that's a key part of it that I want to lift up, that it's not just for government, right? Like, individuals need to be able to see the data. And sometimes, as somebody who worked at big philanthropic firms, we collect a lot of data, but there is never a feedback loop to those individuals that we collected data from. And we have to be responsible in making sure that the data is accessible and readable, right, in a way that they can understand it, because a lot of times the data that we're collecting is really on a lot of vulnerable populations. So I appreciate how you guys really attacked all of the questions and went after it. I just asked, leave us with something, but also leave us with an activation.
Sure. So I'll try to be quick. So I was just in New York last week, 2 weeks ago, for the UN's Commission on the Status of Women. And we had an event that was focused on gender data for gender equality. And so one thing I guess I would leave with is that all of our panelists spoke, and they weren't necessarily technical data people. They were policymakers, and they all spoke and gave examples on how the data that they had was used for policy that changed lives. So in a country in the Pacific Islands, the Solomon Islands, they were using data to, tackle vulnerable populations of women that, weren't necessarily seen without this survey. And they were able to use it and inform policy to target them. Australia had another great example. And so I would just leave it the point that sometimes, we speak about data and, like you said, that feedback loop isn't there. So when it's done with the right policies and safety and privacy and, the individuals in mind, data is really quite powerful in that sense. So to leave with that. And I suppose the action item would be, and a bit of a plug for us is, I'll put in our newsletter in the chat. You can sign up, and at least if you're interested in these conversations from the global perspective, you can sign up for our newsletter and follow along there. But I think documenting these impact stories of data can only help all of us working in this space to really drive it home and get more investments and more funding and more people that can all be working in this space as well.
Thank you, Mercedes.
I would try to be more quickly that I can. I think that as Deidre said, the actionable for all of us is try to maintain all the feedback space, a lot of feedback space that we need, because it's the only way to try to understand if the data that we are publishing or we are using for change people's life. So I think that as an activist, we have to use that data and to try to communicate the benefit of that data. For example, thinking in different solutions for public policy, thinking in different research, thinking in different initiatives, and try to do the work that we do using the data, using evidence as part of our daily lives. And then from a government perspective, I think that it's very important to try to balance the process of opening up data with the privacy law and the privacy technical mechanisms that they had to implement to not too vulnerable personal rights. So to finish my presentation, I would like to invite people and governments that want to see at least the care indicators that we created. If you think that it's useful to measure care needs, that it's useful to measure care services that communitarian organizations provide or government provide, for us it's very important. All the products or the research that we do are products that receive a lot of feedback from people, because our mission and vision of the organization is try to create things that could put data in order to social impact or economy impact or gender impact. So for us, it's very important. And also documents and products are changing a lot of time. And yes, are changing like public policies. For that, I invite all the people and governments that want to see what ODC do in care agenda, please go ahead. And then invite New York City government to implement the care system indicator. Because for us, the comparison it's very important to understand what other cities are doing in the care agenda. And it's relevant to promote the peer exchange between citizens and governments. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, Deidre and Mercedes. And I do want to just lift up the piece. Deidre did drop the link in the chat, so please do sign up for the newsletter. Mercedes, I believe you can drop a link in the chat so folks can understand the care indicators a little bit more and be able to lift them up. I think one thing to note from the New York City lens and perspective is that really, and I think this whole conversation is about this, is we have to use data to improve systems and how we're addressing societal disparities and inequalities. And that's at the core of all of the work that we do. That's at literally the core of all of the programs and offices that we have. It is literally a deliverer of care, right? So how do we know our programs are working? How do we know that people are essentially walking away with quality programs that are really aligned with what we anticipated the impact was? We have to really go back to these individuals and let them tell us how things are working and make sure that that feedback loop is strong and that we're being responsible with how we're utilizing data and opening data so that not just government can use it, but people, advocates, right? Everybody has a sense to understand how well our programs are functioning, because this work is grounded in government being transparent and accountable. So I thank you both today, Deidre and Mercedes. And again, my name is Natifa Ford, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the New York City Young Men's Initiative and the Executive Director of a new office being founded, which is called NYC Her Future, which is grounded on advancing the issues that young women and girls face across New York City.